There is a strange possibility about human life that most people rarely consider. What if the person you believe yourself to be is not really the author of your thoughts, emotions, and behaviors? What if much of what you call yourself is actually a bundle of habits, perceptions, and energies flowing through you, shaped long before you even realized it was happening? That idea sounds unsettling at first, because most of us grow up believing we are independent agents, fully responsible for every thought we think and every action we take. We imagine ourselves as captains steering the ship of our lives through open waters. But if you've ever noticed yourself reacting emotionally before you even had time to think, if you've ever repeated the same mistake in relationships even though you promised yourself you wouldn't, if you've ever wondered why certain habits feel almost automatic, then you have already glimpsed something deeper about the nature of the mind. Maybe you've noticed that your reactions often appear before your reasoning does. You feel irritated before you understand why. You feel anxious before anything bad has happened. You scroll through your phone longer than you intended. You say something you later regret. And afterward, the mind quickly creates a story explaining what just happened. But the reaction came first. The explanation came second. In the next few minutes, you may begin to see something quite profound about the human experience. You may begin to see that what we call the self is often less like a commander giving orders, and more like a narrator telling stories about events that are already unfolding. And once you begin to see that, something remarkable happens. The weight of guilt begins to soften, blame begins to dissolve, and the way you relate to yourself and others begins to change. Let's begin with something simple. Perception. Every moment of your life is made up of perceptions. Sounds enter your ears. Light enters your eyes. Sensations move through your body. Thoughts appear in your mind. Emotions rise and fall. The entire experience of being alive is a continuous stream of perceptions flowing through awareness. But these perceptions do not arise in isolation. They arise through patterns. Imagine a child growing up in a household where conflict is common. Voices are raised frequently. Tension fills the air. Even if no one directly explains what is happening, the child's nervous system learns something very quickly. It learns that the world can become unpredictable. Years later, that same person may notice something curious. In relationships, they feel uneasy during calm moments. Silence feels suspicious. Their mind begins scanning for potential problems. They may become anxious when things seem too quiet. From the outside, it might look like the person is overreacting, but from the inside, the nervous system is simply following a pattern it learned long ago. Perceptions became habits, and habits became identity. This is how much of human behavior forms. Exposure leads to repetition. Repetition creates patterns. Patterns slowly become automatic. Over time, these patterns feel so familiar that we begin to call them who we are. But the truth may be simpler and more mysterious than that. What we call personality might actually be a collection of repeated perceptions and responses shaped by the environments we have passed through. Think about how habits form in everyday life. A person checks their phone during a quiet moment. A notification appears. A small burst of stimulation enters the brain. The brain remembers the pleasant sensation. The next quiet moment arrives, and the hand moves toward the phone again, almost automatically. At first, the behavior feels like a choice. Later, it feels like a reflex. What began as a single perception becomes a repeated pattern. The pattern becomes a habit. The habit becomes a lifestyle. And eventually, the person may say something like, "I'm just someone who can't stay away from my phone." But the self did not create the habit in a vacuum. The habit formed through exposure, repetition, and reinforcement. Now imagine expanding this idea beyond small habits into the entire structure of human life. Our preferences, fears, ambitions, political beliefs, relationship patterns, and emotional reactions often arise from similar processes. Experiences repeat. Neural pathways strengthen. Emotional responses become familiar. The mind builds narratives to explain them. Over time, a story appears. The story says, "This is who I am." But what if the story is simply the mind trying to make sense of patterns already in motion? Human beings are extraordinary meaning-seeking creatures. Our minds constantly search for explanations. When something happens, the mind quickly constructs a narrative connecting the events together. If a business succeeds, we tell ourselves a story about intelligence and strategy. If a relationship ends, we tell ourselves a story about compatibility or mistakes. If an opportunity appears, we tell ourselves a story about timing and effort. Stories help us understand our lives. But stories can also create the illusion that everything happened through deliberate authorship. In reality, life often unfolds through forces that are far more complex. Biology influences mood. Culture shapes ambition. Family history shapes emotional patterns. Economic systems shape opportunity. Technology shapes attention. None of these forces operate entirely within our conscious control, and yet we interpret their outcomes as if they were purely personal decisions. Consider something as ordinary as anger. A person driving through traffic suddenly feels irritated when another car cuts in front of them. The body reacts instantly, muscles tighten, heart rate increases, thoughts appear criticizing the other driver. Only afterward does the mind construct a narrative. That person disrespected me. But the reaction itself appeared automatically. The nervous system detected a potential threat to control or safety, and the response followed a familiar pattern. The story came later. This pattern appears across many areas of life. Habits form through repeated exposure. Emotional reactions form through previous experiences. Beliefs form through cultural conditioning. These forces move through us, like currents moving through water. And yet, the mind continuously claims ownership of them. I chose this. I caused that. This is who I am. But perhaps the self is less like a commander issuing orders and more like a narrator observing the unfolding of events. Now here is where the idea becomes even more interesting. If our perceptions and habits flow through patterns shaped by countless forces beyond conscious control, then much of human life may operate in ways that resemble determinism. Determinism does not necessarily mean that life is rigid or mechanical. It simply suggests that events unfold through chains of causes and conditions. Each moment grows out of the previous one, just as waves move across the surface of an ocean. Patterns repeat. Cycles appear. Tension moves like a pendulum between opposites. Excitement becomes boredom. Confidence becomes doubt. Attachment becomes separation. Expansion becomes contraction. Human experience often moves through these rhythms of contrast. Think about motivation. A person begins a new goal with excitement. Energy rises. Progress happens quickly. But eventually the initial surge fades. Discipline becomes harder. Doubt begins appearing. The pendulum swings. Later the motivation may return again. These cycles appear everywhere in human life, in careers, relationships, creativity, and emotional states. Yet the mind often interprets each moment as if it were permanent. When confidence appears, we believe it will last. When doubt appears, we believe something is wrong. But the rhythm itself may simply be part of the movement of existence. The difficulty is that the human mind resists this idea strongly. Because if life unfolds through patterns shaped by countless causes, then the ego, the sense of personal authorship, becomes less central than we once believed. And that realization can feel threatening. The ego wants control. It wants ownership. It wants credit when things succeed and explanations when things fail. But when we examine our lives honestly, we begin to see how much of our experience is influenced by forces we did not design. This is where another psychological layer appears. Instead of recognizing the complexity of these patterns, people often project responsibility outward. When life goes well, we take credit. When life becomes difficult, we look for someone to blame. We blame other people. We blame circumstances. We blame institutions. Sometimes we blame ourselves harshly. Blame gives the ego a sense of control. But blame also keeps us trapped inside the illusion that everything should have unfolded differently. And perhaps this is where much of human suffering begins. Not simply from the events themselves, but from the stories we tell about them. If we follow this line of thought a little further, something very curious begins to emerge about human behavior. Many of the conflicts we experience with other people may not actually be conflicts between two fully independent individuals. They may be collisions between two different sets of habits, perceptions, and emotional patterns that developed over time. Think about how often arguments unfold in relationships. Two people begin talking about something small. Perhaps it is about money, or time, or a forgotten responsibility. But within minutes, the conversation becomes emotional. Voices rise. Old frustrations suddenly reappear. Each person becomes convinced that the other is the problem. Yet if we step back and observe carefully, something else becomes visible. Each person is reacting from patterns that formed long before the conversation began. One partner may have grown up in a home where criticism was common. Over time, their nervous system learned to expect judgment. So when their partner raises even a mild concern, the body reacts defensively before the mind has time to analyze the situation. The other partner may have grown up in an environment where responsibility was heavily emphasized. They learned that mistakes must be corrected quickly. When something goes wrong, their instinct is to address it immediately. Now imagine these two people in a conversation. One instinctively defends, the other instinctively corrects. Neither reaction is entirely conscious, and suddenly both people believe the other is difficult. But the truth is more subtle. Two different histories of perception are interacting in real time. Two different patterns are unfolding, and the mind quickly turns the situation into a story about personality. You're too sensitive. You're too controlling. The story makes the conflict feel personal, but beneath the story are simply habits of perception reacting to one another. This is one of the reasons human relationships can feel so confusing. We believe we are interacting with fully intentional individuals, yet much of the interaction is actually driven by patterns neither person consciously chose. Now consider how often the mind protects its identity by projecting blame outward. When a difficult emotion appears inside us, the mind immediately looks for an explanation. If we feel envy, we may tell ourselves someone else is arrogant. If we feel insecure, we may interpret someone's confidence as threatening. If we feel uncertain about our direction in life, we may criticize others who appear successful. Projection allows the ego to maintain its self-image. Instead of recognizing that uncomfortable emotions are arising within us, we attribute those feelings to something outside. A coworker receives recognition at work, and suddenly irritation appears. The mind quickly explains the feeling. They must have connections. The system is unfair. A friend posts a picture of a vacation, and comparison arises. The mind quickly explains the discomfort. They're just showing off. In each case, the mind constructs a narrative that protects the sense of self, but what we are actually witnessing is the movement of perception and emotion flowing through patterns built over time. This is why understanding the mechanics of perception can be so liberating. Because once you see that thoughts and emotions arise through conditions rather than pure personal authorship, something begins to soften inside you. You become less defensive. You become less reactive. You begin to observe rather than immediately identify, and perhaps most importantly, you become less interested in blame. This does not mean that people are not responsible for their actions. Responsibility still matters in society. Actions still have consequences. But the emotional intensity surrounding blame begins to lose its grip once you understand how deeply human behavior is shaped by causes and conditions. Imagine watching waves rise and fall on the ocean. Each wave has a unique shape. Some are large, some are small, some move quickly, others slowly dissolve. But no single wave controls the ocean. Each wave is part of a larger movement. In a similar way, human behavior often arises from the interaction of countless forces: biological, cultural, environmental, and experiential. And yet the mind still insists on claiming full authorship. I am this. I did that. This defines me. The irony is that the more tightly we hold on to this sense of rigid identity, the more suffering we tend to experience. Because identity creates expectations. If I believe I am always confident, moments of doubt feel threatening. If I believe I am always kind, Moments of anger feel unacceptable. If I believe I am always successful, moments of failure feel devastating. But when identity becomes less rigid, experiences become easier to observe without attaching them to the core of who we are. Confidence becomes a temporary state rather than a permanent label. Anger becomes a passing emotion rather than a moral flaw. Failure becomes a moment in a larger process rather than a permanent verdict. This shift in perspective leads to another realization that can feel both humbling and freeing at the same time. Much of what we do each day is driven by habits operating beneath conscious awareness. The brain is designed this way for efficiency. If every action required full deliberation, life would become exhausting. So the brain gradually automates repeated behaviors. Driving a car eventually becomes automatic. Typing on a keyboard becomes automatic. Even emotional reactions can become automatic. A certain tone of voice triggers irritation. A particular type of criticism triggers defensiveness. A certain environment triggers anxiety. These reactions occur so quickly that they feel like choices, but in reality, they are patterns firing through neural pathways strengthened by repetition. And once we see that, we begin to notice something else. Our lives often move in cycles. Habits reinforce perceptions. Perceptions reinforce habits. And the cycle continues. A person who repeatedly interprets situations as threatening gradually becomes more anxious. The anxiety then reinforces the interpretation of threat. A person who repeatedly compares themselves to others gradually becomes more insecure. The insecurity then strengthens the habit of comparison. The mind begins living inside loops of perception, but loops can also change, because awareness introduces a new possibility. When you observe a pattern rather than automatically acting on it, a small gap appears between perception and reaction. In that gap, something interesting happens. You realize the pattern is not identical to you. The pattern is simply appearing. This insight can feel subtle at first, but its implications are enormous. Because if the patterns moving through your mind are not identical to your deepest awareness, then the self may not be as fixed as we once believed. Perhaps the self is not a rigid identity at all. Perhaps it is more like a field in which experiences appear and disappear. Thoughts arise, emotions arise, habits arise, stories arise, and then they pass. When people first encounter this idea, they sometimes feel uneasy. If the self is not the solid controlling entity we imagined, then what exactly are we? But if we stay with the question long enough, another possibility emerges. Perhaps we are not the habits. Perhaps we are not the stories. Perhaps we are the awareness in which those habits and stories appear. This shift from identifying with the patterns to observing them changes the emotional tone of life dramatically. Instead of constantly trying to control every internal movement, you begin to watch the patterns unfold. The mind becomes less of a battlefield and more of a landscape. Anger appears like a storm cloud. Joy appears like sunlight. Fear appears like wind moving through trees. None of these movements define the sky itself. And as this perspective deepens, another important change occurs. The need to constantly prove ourselves begins to fade. Because if the self is not a rigid identity that must be defended at all costs, then the energy previously spent on maintaining that identity becomes available for something else, something quieter, something simpler, the experience of being, not achieving, not competing, not constantly improving, simply being present within the flow of existence. But modern culture rarely encourages this perspective. Our societies tend to reward constant activity. We celebrate productivity, ambition, and achievement. We measure worth through accomplishments and recognition. Be someone. Do something. Make something of yourself. These messages appear everywhere. And while ambition can lead to meaningful accomplishments, it can also trap people in endless cycles of striving, doing more, earning more, becoming more, but rarely asking a deeper question. What if existence itself is already enough? This question introduces a profound shift. Instead of defining life primarily through doing, we begin to explore the possibility of being. And that shift brings us closer to the deeper insight hidden within this entire discussion. Because once the grip of identity loosens, once blame becomes less compelling, once patterns are observed rather than blindly repeated, something remarkable becomes possible. Compassion. Not the moral kind people try to force through rules, but the natural kind that emerges when you understand how human beings actually function. When you see that others are also shaped by habits, perceptions, and histories they did not fully choose, harsh judgment becomes harder to maintain. Instead of asking, "Why are they like that?" you begin to wonder, what experiences shaped those patterns? And that question opens the door to a completely different way of living. There is another layer to this understanding that most people resist seeing, and it has to do with something deeply rooted in human psychology: the need to feel special, central, and in control. The mind quietly builds an image of itself as the author of its life story. It wants to believe that its achievements are the result of personal brilliance and that its struggles are either injustices or mistakes that should not have happened. This tendency is not necessarily malicious. It is simply how the ego organizes experience. But the consequence of this subtle narcissism is that we begin interpreting everything through the lens of personal importance. Events become about us. Reactions become about us. Even the unpredictable movements of life feel like they are directed specifically at us. Yet if we step back and observe life from a wider perspective, something very different begins to appear. The world is not revolving around any single person. Billions of people are moving through their own cycles of perception, habit, and circumstance at the same time. Each person feels like the central character of their own story. But from the outside, all of these stories are unfolding simultaneously like countless waves moving across the surface of a vast ocean. Each wave has its own shape and movement, but none of them control the ocean itself. This realization can feel humbling, but it can also be deeply relieving. Because if the universe is not organizing events around our personal narratives, then many of the things we take so personally were never meant to be personal attacks in the first place. A business fails not because the universe targeted one individual, but because economic cycles rise and fall. A relationship ends not because one person is uniquely flawed, but because two patterns of life sometimes move in different directions. A moment of rejection or embarrassment may feel enormous from the inside, but within the broader movement of life, it is simply one moment among millions. Consider how often ambition is shaped by invisible forces that have little to do with conscious intention. A young professional decides they want to become successful in their career. They work late nights, compete with colleagues, and constantly measure their progress against others. At first, it feels like pure determination, but if they pause and reflect honestly, they may begin to notice how many influences quietly shaped this ambition. Perhaps they grew up hearing praise only when they achieved something. Perhaps their culture celebrates wealth and status as symbols of worth. Perhaps social media constantly displays the highlights of other people's lives, creating the impression that everyone else is moving faster. The ambition feels personal, but the fuel behind it often comes from cultural conditioning. Now imagine that same person reaching the milestone they once dreamed about. The promotion arrives, the income increases, recognition appears. For a moment, there is excitement. But then something surprising happens. The satisfaction fades faster than expected. The mind begins looking toward the next achievement, the next level, the next comparison. The cycle continues. Why does this happen so often? Because the habit of striving has become part of the pattern itself. The mind does not simply pursue a goal, it becomes accustomed to the state of pursuit. Once the goal is reached, the system continues searching for another target. It is like a pendulum swinging forward and backward, constantly moving but rarely coming to rest. This is one of the reasons modern life can feel strangely exhausting even when we appear successful on the surface. Many people spend years chasing outcomes that promise lasting satisfaction, only to discover that the mind quickly adapts and begins the cycle again. The pattern of striving continues, but the sense of fulfillment remains temporary. At some point, many people experience a quiet realization that something about this rhythm feels incomplete. They begin asking questions that rarely appeared earlier in life. Questions like, why does every achievement feel temporary? Why does the mind keep searching for something more even after reaching goals that once seemed so important? Why does satisfaction fade so quickly? These questions are often the beginning of a deeper shift in awareness, because they invite us to examine not just the goals we pursue, but the underlying movement of perception and habit itself. And when we look carefully, we begin to see how much of human life unfolds through contrasts: excitement and boredom, confidence and doubt, connection and loneliness, hope and disappointment. The mind moves between these states constantly, like a pendulum swinging between opposites. When excitement appears, we cling to it and hope it will last. When boredom appears, we resist it and search for stimulation. But the pendulum keeps moving, regardless of our preferences. The same pattern appears in relationships. At the beginning of a romantic relationship, novelty and curiosity create a powerful sense of excitement. Two people feel fascinated by one another. Conversations feel effortless. Every interaction carries energy. But over time, familiarity appears. The excitement softens. New challenges arise as two different personalities begin navigating everyday life together. At this stage, many people interpret the shift as a failure. They believe the relationship has lost something essential. But in many cases, the relationship is simply moving through the natural rhythm of human connection. Novelty becomes familiarity. Curiosity becomes understanding. Passion becomes companionship. The movement continues. Understanding these cycles does not remove difficulty from life, but it changes the way we interpret it. Instead of assuming something is wrong whenever the pendulum swings toward discomfort, we begin recognizing that contrast is built into the structure of experience itself. The mind moves between states not because we are doing life incorrectly, but because this movement is part of how perception operates. This insight leads to another important observation about human suffering. Much of our pain does not come from the experiences themselves, but from the expectation that life should remain on one side of the pendulum. We want constant happiness, constant success, constant certainty. But existence appears to operate through contrast rather than permanence. Night follows day. Winter follows summer. Energy rises and falls, and human emotion moves through similar cycles. Once we begin to see this, the impulse to control every internal experience begins to loosen. Instead of forcing ourselves to remain in one emotional state, we start allowing experiences to move through their natural rhythm. This does not mean passively surrendering to destructive habits or harmful actions. Awareness still matters. Responsibility still matters. But the frantic struggle to control every internal fluctuation begins to soften, and something else begins to grow in its place. Acceptance. Not resignation, but acceptance of the fact that life unfolds through movement. When we stop fighting every uncomfortable state, the mind gains space to observe rather than react. And in that space, another realization slowly emerges. If so much of our behavior flows through patterns shaped by perception and habit, then the most meaningful response we can cultivate is not endless self-judgment or blame. It is awareness combined with intention. Awareness allows us to see patterns clearly. Intention allows us to guide our actions within those patterns. And when these two qualities come together, something deeply ethical begins to appear naturally. Because once you understand how easily habits and perceptions shape behavior, harsh judgment toward others begins to soften. Instead of assuming that people are simply choosing to be difficult, selfish, or aggressive, you begin recognizing that many of these behaviors are expressions of patterns that formed through countless experiences. A person raised in fear may react defensively. A person raised in scarcity may cling to control. A person raised in competition may struggle to trust. Understanding these patterns does not excuse harmful behavior, but it changes the emotional response from condemnation to curiosity. Instead of asking, "What is wrong with them?" the mind begins asking, "What forces shape this behavior?" And this question naturally leads toward compassion. Not sentimental compassion, but grounded understanding. Because when you realize that the same forces shaping others are also shaping you, the illusion of moral superiority begins to dissolve. We are all participating in the same unfolding process. Perceptions flow, habits form, stories appear, and life continues moving forward. From this perspective, the purpose of awareness is not to become perfect or to escape the movement of life entirely. The purpose of awareness is simply to see clearly enough that we stop adding unnecessary suffering through blame, denial, and projection. When we stop fighting the basic mechanics of human existence, energy becomes available for something much simpler and more meaningful. Living with care, choosing actions that cause less harm, supporting the well-being of others when we can, and appreciating the quiet experience of being alive within the vast movement of existence itself. But there is still one final insight waiting at the end of this journey, an insight that brings everything together. When people begin to see life through this wider lens, something subtle but profound begins to change inside them. The constant urge to control every outcome slowly starts to loosen, not because effort becomes meaningless, but because the illusion of total authorship begins to dissolve. You start to realize that existence is not something you are single-handedly engineering moment by moment. Instead, you are participating in a vast unfolding process where countless forces meet: biology, culture, history, chance, environment, and perception. At first, this realization can feel unsettling. After all, most of us were raised to believe that control is the key to security. Work harder, plan more carefully, think more positively. If something goes wrong, correct it, improve it, fix it. The message is always the same. If you do the right things, life should unfold exactly as you intend. But real life rarely behaves this way. Even the most disciplined person cannot control every variable shaping their experience. Economic shifts appear unexpectedly. Relationships evolve in ways no one predicted. Health changes. Opportunities arise or disappear without warning. A single moment, a meeting, a conversation, a coincidence can alter the direction of an entire life. When we hold tightly to the belief that everything should be controllable, these events feel like personal failures or injustices. But when we begin to see life as a complex flow of interacting patterns, the emotional weight surrounding these events changes. The question slowly shifts. Instead of asking, "How do I force life to follow my plan?" a quieter question emerges. How do I move wisely within the flow that is already happening? This shift marks the difference between living primarily through doing and living more deeply through being. For most of modern life, we are trained to focus on doing. Achieve something, build something, prove something. The language of productivity surrounds us from childhood onward. Schools measure performance. Workplaces reward output. Social media amplifies visible accomplishments. Everywhere we look, the message seems to be that value comes from what we produce. There is nothing inherently wrong with action or achievement. Building, creating, and contributing can be meaningful parts of human life. But when doing becomes the only way we measure existence, something essential quietly disappears. The experience of simply being alive. Being does not mean inactivity or withdrawal from life. It means recognizing that existence itself is already unfolding before we begin adding our efforts to it. The breath entering your lungs. The light moving across a room. The subtle rhythm of thoughts passing through awareness. These experiences do not require achievement. They simply happen. When attention returns to this simple fact, the mind begins to relax its constant demand for improvement and control. You still act in the world. You still make decisions. But the actions arise from a quieter place rather than from restless,